Is I'll just kind of go like this from my chair with it. So. Okay, what do you want me to do? I can't. My book had like 8 various iterations of basically the same title, so I understand. Do you want me to say it? Okay, then what do you want it to be? Yeah, Gotcha. War on Poverty to Grassroots Feminism, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's good. All right. We'll have a couple minutes, so. On the back, too. Oh, that's hilarious. Somebody left their doodle. They're good. They're really good. Oh. Okay. Yeah. So, we've got the 5-minute one, and we've got the 1-minute one. Okay? So if and then the cane comes out and I yank you off. I think we're good. Thanks. We can, yeah, have enough time. Well, and because everything's been running over, and if we can both run over, that would be kind of amazing. We have been told to talk into the mics for the camera. So, hi everyone. Welcome to the panel, the precise name of which I'm forgetting. Hope, Change, and Feminism, the Southern Feminism panel. That's what we are. We'll just shorten it down to the essentials. My name is Melissa Estes Blair. I'm an associate professor of history and a member of the Gender and Women's Studies faculty at Warren Wilson College, which is a tiny little college outside of Asheville, North Carolina. I have the gracious permission of the panelists to take a minute to shamelessly promote my book, which will be out in December, that looks at feminism in Denver, Indianapolis, and Durham, specifically looking at how pre-existing women's organizations like the League of Women Voters and the YWCA became important channels for feminist activism in those kinds of cities that were not the sort of intellectual centers of the movement. So that'll be out in December from University of Georgia Press. That's my shameless plug for what I do. I am thrilled to introduce our panelists. I'm going to introduce everybody in the order in which they will be speaking. And then just let them come up without me having to get back up every time between their papers. And we're actually just going to go in order from nearest to me to farthest. So our first paper today will be from Hannah Dudley-Shotwell. Hannah received her bachelor's degree from the College of William & Mary and is currently just finished her comps in the PhD program at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. She's focusing on women's and gender history, and her dissertation will examine feminist self-help in the post-Roe versus Wade era. There we go. Our second paper will be from Dr. Jessie Wilkerson, doctor as of last week. Woohoo! So last week, Jessie defended her dissertation entitled Where Movements Meet, From the War on Poverty to Grassroots Feminism in the Appalachian South, 1965 to 1980, at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She will be graduating in May with her PhD. She's currently an AAUW American Fellow, and in the fall, she will be joining the Department of History and the Department of Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi. Our third paper will be from Joey Fink. Joey is a PhD candidate in history at UNC Chapel Hill. This year, she is the Hugh McCall Fellow at the Center for the Study of the American South. Her dissertation, The Many Norma Rays, Working Class Women in the Struggle to Organize J.P. Stevens in the 1970s, examines the role of working class women in the campaign to unionize Southern textile mills, and uses oral history and archival research to explore the real-life stories behind the Academy Award-winning film Norma Ray. Her research reveals the connections between labor struggles, the women's movement, and civil rights activism in the 1970s. This is not what she's going to be talking to you about today, by the way, which is why she's getting a little bit longer of a thing here. She's talking about a second project, which she'll go into herself, but she's conducted interviews for the Southern Oral History Project's Long Women's Movement in the American South, as Jessie has as well, and she completed her BA in history here at UMass Boston, here in Boston. So, all right, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Hannah.
How's my volume? Is that okay? All right, I'm going to start with a little anecdote, which I bet many of you in the room are probably familiar with. Some of you maybe more so than others. It starts in April of 1971 at a women's meeting in the back of the Every Woman's Bookstore, which was in Los Angeles. And Carol Downer, who is indeed at the conference, sat on a table, lifted her skirt, inserted a speculum into her vagina, and let the rest of the room look at her cervix. She also showed them how they could do this process of cervical self-examination, using the speculum and a hand mirror and a flashlight to see for themselves. So then using self-examination as a tool for learning about their own bodies became known amongst feminist women, especially mostly white middle-class feminists at this point. They started to call this process self-help. And at first, self-help mostly happened in like feminist spaces like the bookstore or in women's homes. But then after Roe v. Wade, which was in 1973 and legalized abortion, feminists started moving self-help into a clinic setting. The Atlanta Feminist Women's Health Center, which I'm going to talk about today, is one of those clinics. And I want to talk about the implications of practicing self-help in a clinic instead of in more traditional feminist spaces and then their homes as well. And I want to ask to what extent this practice was in line with what the founders of self-help first conceived of as the point of self-help. Like, how did putting self-help in a medical setting depart from how they originally intended it or did it? So my argument is that in the decades following Roe v. Wade, the Atlanta Feminist Women's Health Center both employed many of the fundamental tenets of feminist self-help, but also they expanded upon the meaning and the practice of self-help. So many scholars and activists today, they believe that feminist self-help, if they know anything about it, they think that it kind of fell by the wayside after the Roe verdict in 1973. But in fact, as my larger project, my dissertation will show, this practice, self-help, took on a lot of new forms and settings after Roe. And one new setting, as I said, is in the clinic, like the Atlanta one. So in those places, feminists exercised self-help much as they had before Roe v. Wade, and perhaps more importantly, they kind of expanded on it and made it do new and useful things. And I have 4 arguments about how they did that. The first is they held a lot of participatory clinics, a kind of different variety of participatory clinics in the clinics. And there, women could participate in their own gynecological exam, much as they had in the original self-help groups. They could learn breast exam, they could learn pregnancy screening, that kind of thing. More on that later. The second way that they expanded upon it and used it in the clinics, the person, if you went to a clinic, your primary contact person wasn't a nurse or a doctor, though they were there. Your primary contact person was a laywoman who her goal and her mission and her job was to treat a client as her peer and to make sure that that client understood every step of her gynecological procedure. She would even act as that client's advocate if there were an emergency, like she had to go to the hospital for complications. And related to that, the third way, the feminists tried to make abortions and self-examined as woman-controlled as possible. And they did this by, even in an abortion procedure, trying to give them choices in every single step as much as they could. And the fourth way that the women who worked in the Feminist Women's Health Centers tried to make self-help really relevant to what they were doing and a part of their everyday actions was to also have and be part of self-help groups outside of the clinic, maybe with a group of friends or also like taking it to, say, universities and that kind of thing. And we'll talk more about that as well. So overall, I want to argue that self-help flourished in feminist clinics in spite of the fact that the very nature of this medical setting was kind of contradictory to the original vision of self-help. So let's back up to Carol Downer's original story, where feminist self-help kind of emerged as part of the women's health movement in the late 60s and early 70s. So this movement criticized and drew attention to the ways that the authority to make decisions about women's health and women's reproduction, it lied within the medical institution, and especially with doctors, not with the woman themselves. So then challenging this idea that only doctors had the power to examine a woman's body and analyze her physical maladies, that women's health activists wanted to argue that the male-dominated, and they did argue, that the male-dominated medical field left women completely estranged from their own bodies and mystified by their physical selves. And a lot of the earliest members of the women's health movement taught themselves skills that had previously been performed pretty much exclusively by male doctors, and they called this practice self-help, which is what the general topic of my dissertation. So by appropriating their bodies as tools of knowledge, women took the power away from these physicians, and some people like to say they held the power in their own hands. Many self-help activists, they thought of cervical self-examination particularly, which is when they used the speculum and a flashlight and a mirror to examine their own cervix. They thought of that as a critical way of reclaiming power over their own bodies. So that's exactly what Carol Downer was doing in 1971, and then it continued in the clinics. So using self-examination, a woman could familiarize herself with her body so that if she noticed that there were any irregularities, she could either take care of them or she could go to a doctor. And the women who practiced self-examination, they emphasized that women's experiences and even their bodies, those were a really important source of information for themselves and for other women, maybe even more important than anything a doctor could tell them. So gatherings of women, often in a woman's home, in which they use self-exam as a tool to learn about their bodies, this became known as the practice self-help. And those were called self-help groups. Many members of self-help groups tried to maintain an egalitarian atmosphere amongst them, which is, that's pretty true throughout the feminist movement, as you've probably heard a lot this weekend. And the goal was that no one was the leader. They were just trying to support each other by sharing and learning knowledge about each other and about themselves. And self-helpers conceived of their efforts as woman-controlled feminist empirical research. And when I say they did research, they did things like they took pap smears, some groups took pap smears daily, and they tracked data like their basal body temperature and the pH of their vaginal secretions, all in an effort to kind of redefine what normal was, a normal menstrual cycle, a normal woman's body, that kind of thing. And even some advanced groups kind of ventured into a new territory called menstrual extraction, which is the process of emptying one's uterus into a glass jar during menstruation or early pregnancy, and that's another huge topic that I'll go into for my dissertation. Excuse me. So after Roe v. Wade in 1973, these same feminist self-helpers and then some new recruits started opening feminist women's health centers to provide abortions and also gynecology for women. And the Atlanta Clinic is one of these clinics. It's part of a much larger movement of women's healthcare institutions, and it provided gynecological care and family planning. Specifically, this clinic in particular was part of what was known as the Federation of Feminist Women's Health Centers, which is this large network of clinics that provided abortions and gynecological care based on feminist self-help. That was like their foundation tenet. And the Federation got together every year. They would work together. They were constant communication with each other. In the decades after Roe, they wrote several books about women's health and abortion, and they were always sharing their ideas back and forth. The women who worked in these clinics, like the Atlanta one, they would travel around to the other clinics sometimes and get training there and see what's going on so that they all were kind of providing a standard method of care. Two women, Lynn Randall and Lynn Wilkerson, opened the Atlanta Clinic, and that was in 1977, so quite a bit after Roe. The clinic relied not just on doctors and nurses, but as I said, also on laywomen, not just as their directors, but also as their staff. There was pretty much an army of laywomen health workers doing a lot of the work in these clinics. That included everything from taking out the trash to conducting and demonstrating for women self-exams. So going back to those 4 ways that the clinic kind of continued self-help practices, the first way they did it was by offering well woman care, which is very much along the lines of self-help, and they did it in a setting called a participatory clinic. And what they did there was women screened themselves for potential reproductive problems. The participatory clinics were much like the pre-Roe self-help groups, but there were 2 key exceptions that I've found. First of all, they happened in a clinic instead of in a woman's house. And second of all, most of the time, there were 2 laywoman clinic employees there, known as health workers, who facilitated the clinic. So bringing self-help into a clinic and paying women, even lay women, to facilitate the group kind of made it have a more institutional legitimacy, but at the same time, it perhaps undermined self-help's radical potential as it was originally conceived. In the beginning, self-help and self-exam, as I said, could take place anywhere that a group of women gathered, especially in a woman's home. And clinic leaders understood that the medical setting meant something a little different for women. They also knew that having salaried facilitators kind of perhaps weakened the radical nature of self-help, and they worked really hard to make sure this wasn't the case, or to make sure it was the case as little as possible. One way that they did this was to use 2 ways to do this, in order to make women feel equal in the groups, even though there were these paid health workers. So the first way was a lot of the health workers' knowledge was based on the other participatory clinics they had been to, and also on their own experiences examining their own bodies. And it was their job to share information in this open, non-authoritative manner, and also to learn from the women each time they had a clinic. It wasn't their job to present the facts at all, but just to facilitate a discussion. They expected them to act as equal members of the self-help group, bringing knowledge mostly from their own experiences. And the second way that the clinic encouraged equality within the group was by encouraging women to ask questions of each other, not just relying on the health workers' knowledge. And clinic leaders hoped that fostering such an atmosphere of self-exploration and self-awareness would mean that women took their health into their own hands and became advocates for themselves in the doctor's office as well. Including the 2 health workers, these participatory clinics were usually about 6 to 8 people. And the health workers would demonstrate cervical self-exam and breast exams for the group, and then the women would go around and take turns conducting their own self-exams if they wanted to. Health workers often also showed women how to do their own pregnancy screening tests, sometimes with the urine test, but also by examining their own cervixes to see what changes pregnancy caused in their bodies. In some of the clinics, the women discussed birth control, and they did cervical cap fittings. Cervical cap is a method of barrier contraception. They also often discussed the prevention and treatment and the cure of all sorts of common health problems using both home remedies and also prescription drugs, being sure to let women balance both self-help and medical interventions using whatever method they chose. They also offered a sort of expansion of self-help clinics in the form of what they called abortion groups, so that women could, who were about to terminate their pregnancies, could get together and discuss this with other women in a group before they did so. The second way that they tried to honor the tenets of self-help was through this client-health worker relationship that I talked about earlier. Here's a quote from an early clinic text. The advanced self-help clinic groups know that if this movement is to succeed, it will do so only through sisterhood. The concept of self-help stresses sisterhood, and that makes it possible for the benefits from collective knowledge, collective experiences, collective training, and especially the sisterly concern for one another. So clinic workers really wanted the health workers to follow this pre-Roe idea of self-help in the relationship with their clients. Their job was to make sure that a client really understood every single thing that was going on in any procedure she was having at the clinic. And this stems directly from self-help. They were also supposed to help the women relax, so they might offer to hold her hand during an abortion or massage her abdomen, remind her to breathe, that kind of thing. So I think it's worth noting here that even with the best of intentions, the clinic workers didn't always meet these expectations, obviously. Sisterly solidarity was an ideal, one that they strove for really hard, but it was obviously complicated by race and class and job titles, And the third way that they tried to make sure that they were embodying the principles of self-help was by making abortions as woman-controlled as possible, so by giving her input into every part of the procedure. For one thing, they used local anesthesia instead of general, which was really uncommon. There was only one other clinic in Georgia that did that, so that meant she was aware and conscious during her procedure. They also let her decide if she wanted the paper drape. They let her choose what kind of pain pill she would want, or if she wanted a Xanax. They could also choose whether or not they wanted to see the sonogram of the fetus, and it was the clinic's job to make sure that she could choose for herself. She was educated about it, but then could choose for herself. So the final way they worked to keep self-help alive was by spreading self-help out into the community. They did this in so many different ways. They did it at universities, including Spelman, the historically black liberal arts college for women. They encouraged women self-help. They encouraged health workers to start their own self-help clinics. They did a tour in the late 80s to teach the self-help procedure of menstrual extraction, all sorts of different ways. I'll just conclude by saying that in the years after Roe v. Wade, self-help took on new shapes both inside and outside clinics, such as the Atlanta Feminist Women's Health Center. Women took part in participatory clinics, and they put self-help into a medical facility. Laywomen health workers continued feminist self-help, the tradition of it, by learning from and supporting each other. Women controlled many aspects of their abortions and their gynecology, and they were totally aware of the procedure. And feminist clinics worked to spread self-help beyond clinic doors, and they used it to conduct feminist research in innovative ways, for example, with the barrier method of contraception, as I mentioned earlier. So feminist self-help, I think, is still alive and well today. Again, a topic I'll explore much more in my dissertation. And this is largely as a result of what happened in the clinics like the Atlanta Feminist Women's Health Center. There, women strove to keep self-help alive in spite of the challenges of doing so in a medical setting. Thank you, guys.
Good afternoon. First, I want to thank Hannah for taking the initiative to bring us together and to have one of the, I think, the only panel on Southern feminism at this conference, which I think, I'm glad we're here. I think it's important. So the title of my paper is To Stay Here, You're Going to Have to Fight Like Hell, Grassroots Feminism in the Appalachian South. And can you all hear me okay? Okay. And this is drawn from the last chapter of my dissertation. I trace the war on poverty from the 1960s and all the campaigns that came out of it in the 1970s. So this is just one small piece. So I want to begin with a quote from an interview with Barb Green, an interview that I did with Barb Green, a white anti-poverty and social justice activist who worked in the mountains of Tennessee and Kentucky in the 1970s and 80s. After she introduced the phrase grassroots feminism, I asked her what she meant. She replied, quote, "Grassroots women are more about place. I think they're more about the land. They're more about family. I mean, not that middle-class feminists don't care anything about that, but that kind of justice, a real sense of justice. It's not a justice necessarily about wages. It's not just economic justice. It's an emotional justice. It's not a justice necessarily, it's a way to be, a way to interact, a sense of fairness beyond me and mine, racial justice and all of that, classism and all of that. Grassroots feminism encompasses all of those things." Building on Barb's definition of grassroots feminism, I have examined the local feminist and gender-conscious movements that sprouted up in the Appalachian South in the 1970s and 80s. I see Barb's theory of grassroots feminism as more a method than one more modified version of feminism that is a response to so-called white middle-class feminism. Rather, for me, it has provided a framework to understand the dynamic activism of women in Appalachia, both locals and activists who join the movement of movements there, and to approach this history with the capacious view of feminism that the women themselves held. However, as excited as I was to hear Barb's definition of feminism, I did not necessarily expect to find much evidence of feminist activism in the mountains. The most prominent historians of the region had basically mourned the fact that feminism did not gain much of a foothold in the Mountain South. And the synthetic narratives of the women's movement don't say much about the region. Yet, as I trace the history of women's networks that mobilized during the war on poverty and that helped to sustain campaigns for social justice in the 1970s, I came across numerous campaigns for gender justice. Before I provide examples, I want to set the context. When President Lyndon B. Johnson's federal war on poverty targeted the Appalachian South beginning in 1965, Women saw a unique opportunity to route resources to the needs of their families and communities and to gain a political education. After the passage of the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 and its call for maximum feasible participation of the poor, women in Appalachia, like women in poor communities across the country, flocked to anti-poverty programs as staff, volunteers, and community organizers. And we're going to hear more about those community organizers from Joey. They made sure that anti-poverty programs addressed issues particular to the region, such as high rates of unemployment, the need for robust public assistance, barriers to healthcare and education because of their rural location. Federal initiatives provided openings for women to enter into new political debates and become voices for change in their communities. Galvanized by the war on poverty, women fostered diverse coalitions and crisscrossed the 1960s and 70s social movements as they became leaders and foot soldiers in what contemporaries called the Appalachian Movement, a series of interrelated regional campaigns for welfare rights, community health, labor rights, environmental justice, and women's liberation. Today, I want to share with you just one scene from the regional women's movement, and it's a scene that I think represents how gender, place, and class intertwined in Appalachia. On March 9th, 1975, the Appalachian Women's Rights Organization held a meeting to celebrate International Women's Day, a day after the official International Women's Day. And it's a time when women around the globe marched for women's rights. Over 70 women and men gathered at a community center in Wheelwright, Kentucky, a formerly booming industrial town that had been fading since the 1950s. The meeting began with a local woman singing "The Impossible Dream," an anthem which had recently appeared in the movie musical Man of La Mancha. You may have been expecting like some bluegrass hymn, but no. So this was a song popular at political events. Bobby Kennedy used it in his campaigns. So this song builds to the declaration that the narrator is committed, quote, to fight for the right without question or pause, to be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. After the opening, a lineup of some of the busiest and best-known female leaders of the Appalachian movement described their work and shared their ideas about how to improve women's lives. Eula Hall, Sudie Crusenberry, and Bessie Smith Gayhart sat before the crowd, three white middle-aged mothers who had participated in some of the most dramatic struggles in Appalachia since the 1930s. Their coming together under the banner of International Women's Day sheds light on the intersections of local and national movements and reveals how these women envision themselves as part of the struggle for women's equality. Eula Hall had begun her activist career as a volunteer in the war on poverty. She was one of the anti-poverty workers. She became a leader in the Eastern Kentucky Welfare Rights Organization, and she helped to found the Mud Creek Clinic, which continues to provide health care at low cost or for free. And I should say this is a mostly white welfare rights organization and movement, which we don't know as much about as the Black welfare rights movement. So the clinic that Eula helped to found also became a space where local women met and discussed family planning, domestic violence, and welfare rights. Eula and Dr. Eleanor Graham, a feminist and former civil rights and anti-poverty worker who moved to the mountains in the early 70s to work at the clinic, founded the Appalachian Women's Rights Organization. The two women built on a series of meetings, all women's meetings, and they drew from the energy of a recent miners' strike in Harlan County, Kentucky, in which women had been key and vocal leaders, captured in the film Harlan County, USA. Eula opened the International Women's Day event by describing the goals of this new organization, explaining that its goal was to, quote, protect women and to encourage them to get involved in their equal rights. She then emphasized what she saw as the most significant problems facing women: managing a family on welfare, job discrimination, and domestic violence. These problems compounded to keep women poor and powerless. Quote, I don't think that in Appalachia there's anything worse than being poor and being a woman, said Hall. She closed her speech by calling for women to fight back against discrimination and to do so in solidarity. Quote, "It's much easier to combat a problem if you've got support." Representing the Brookside Women's Club from Harlan County, Sudie Crusenberry shared how women had rallied behind the United Mine Workers of America during the organizing drive in Harlan. The Brookside women became film stars in Barbara Koppel's Oscar-winning documentary film, Harlan County, USA, in which Koppel captured the women's steely resolve to improve their communities and their own lives through the union struggle. Sudie Crusenberry, daughter and wife of disabled miners and mother of 4 children, had become the president of the club. On the face of it, the club appeared to be simply a supporter, kind of like an auxiliary of the all-male union. But Sudie and others revealed how the union campaign was part of a broader community movement sustained by women, and that women faced unique and particular challenges in the coal fields. Sudie often spoke about the dangerous conditions she and her family encountered daily, what one scholar has termed, quote, "the violence of everyday life," common in the coal fields where the water was polluted, threats of mudslides and flooding related to mining were persistent, and women lived with the fear that their male kin would be smashed in the mines, and there were relatively few jobs for women, so they were heavily dependent on those jobs. Mothers and wives, the caregivers of miners and potential miners, had a stake in changing the ways that the mines operated. Sudie told the crowd in Wheelwright, quote, "We've seen it rough, and we was treated rough, but we won victory." So they won a labor contract. "I believe in standing up for our rights together." For Sudie, women's rights had to include a discussion about life, labor, and daily threats in the coal fields. Bessie Smith Gayhart shared her experiences as a strip mining activist. A member of a local chapter of Appalachian group To Save the Land and People, Gayhart was among a group of women who had been involved in protracted battles to stop strip mining in their communities. Women reported how they dealt daily with dangerous conditions produced by strip mine operations, including mud and rock slides that made roads impassable, preventing them from traveling and their children from going to school. Strip mining also had harmful psychological effects, as well as homes and grave sites being ruined. Several years before the Wheelwright meeting, Gayhart had led a group of women, including Eula Hall, when they staged a sit-in at a strip mining site and gained national attention. Gayhart told the crowd, quote, "I was born and raised in East Kentucky, and I'm going to stay, but to stay here, you're going to have to fight like hell." She declared that women were as capable as men and that they could do anything, quote, "if we put our minds to it." Her phrase echoed the kinds of statements one might hear from middle-class women climbing the professional ladder or newly arrived in universities. But coming from Gayhart, the phrase took on new meaning. If they fought hard enough, women could bring a strip mining operation to a halt and effectively protect communities and homes. Gayhart was not just talking about women's individual achievement. These were women fighting for their homes and livelihood. Now, on the stage with local women, veteran activist Lynn Wells had traveled from Detroit, Michigan, to discuss the meaning of International Women's Day and to dispel myths about the women's liberation movement. Her presence pointed to the importance of coalitions that had been that had undergirded many of the social justice movements that rolled across the mountains. Wells began participating in civil rights demonstrations in Washington, D.C. at age 14, and she had been a member of civil rights and student organizations as they unfolded in the 1960s. By the time of the Wheelwright meeting, she was a member of the October League, a Marxist-Leninist faction that had broken away from SDS and sought to organize the U.S. working class. The League also stated in its constitution, quote, "Women's liberation is a component part of proletarian revolution, and the October League firmly upholds the revolutionary struggle for the full equality and the emancipation of women." Wells emphasized that women's rights included more than, quote, "the right to be mayor." They included the right to decent jobs and child care as well. She argued that the women's movement was not about giving up children and family in order to be free, but about giving women basic economic rights. Wells passed out International Women's Day / October League buttons and one of these Sudie Crusenberry placed in her scrapbook that I came across years later. The International Women's Day celebration in Wheelwright points to several themes that emerge in the history of women's activism in Appalachia in the early 70s. First, the topics discussed reflected the decade-long anti-poverty and welfare rights work of women in Appalachia, pointing to a process of gender consciousness that developed out of other democratic struggles. Second, the meeting capitalized on the coalitional work that defined women's organizing in the Mountain South, bringing together welfare rights, labor, women's liberation, and anti-strip mining activists under the banner of the official women's movement. Like the iterations of the women's movement elsewhere, feminism in Appalachia gained strength as it drew upon women's diverse experiences and backgrounds. Coalition building was not always easy or successful, yet in Appalachia, organizing around gender justice almost always arose out of cross-class, cross-generational alliances. Third, like Black women and Latinas, white Appalachian women overwhelmingly rejected gender separatism. They focused instead on social transformation that would improve life for poor and working class families in the coal fields. At the same time, they sought to bring visibility to Appalachian women. They understood that part of building strong coalitions which could achieve equality involved public recognition of women's contributions and their particular struggles. Finally, this scene suggests grassroots feminism, what I started the paper with. And I believe grassroots feminism best describes how women drew on the particulars of living as a female in the coal fields to address how gender inequality functioned in their lives. Historian Stephanie Gilmore has recently applied this concept to her study of local chapters of the National Organization of Women. She uses it, quote, to refer to women whose activism was not represented in the dominant sites of activism on the East Coast, and to explore the local context in which now chapters formed. To take that idea a step further, not only do place and issues differ for grassroots feminists, but the very formation of gender consciousness is distinct. Distant from organizations such as NOW, women in Appalachia developed a feminist critique from the ground up as they responded to particular conditions in their communities and constructed their arguments for equality on the decade-long work of female anti-poverty and community activists and the still older tradition of union organizing. The history of the regional women's movement that burst forth in the 70s is a powerful reminder of the breadth and depth of the US women's movement. Part of the power of the movement lay in its capaciousness. And I think it was Linda Gordon yesterday who said we have to rethink what a women's issue was. It looks different in different places. At the height of the movement, women from various backgrounds gathered and drew from their own experience to speak about women's issues, always a fluctuating category that reflected each place and each woman's experience. In the Mountain South, working class and rural women's gender interests were defined in battles between labor and capital and deeply influenced by movements for economic justice. Yet this movement was also short-lived, with the most prominent women's organizations losing funding and steam by the 1990s as new challenges arose, like deindustrialization and growing inequality that has dogged working class families. My hope is that by expanding the lens of feminism and broadening the cast of characters, we will see new and refreshing models of a feminism that refused to separate gender from class or race, and that sought solutions to, as Nancy Fraser calls it, quote, the injustices of distribution that continue to profoundly shape working class, poor, and rural women's lives. Thank you.
Jesse's thank you to the panel, my fellow panelists, and thank you to you all for coming. It's the last panel, last paper of the last panel of the day, so if anyone is feeling the post-lunch fatigue or end of conference overwhelming, feel free to stand up, stretch your legs, whatever you need to do. There were so many great panels this weekend that I really had to resist the urge to revise this paper after every panel I went to address the things that I've been learning, to incorporate these new ideas I'm encountering. But I actually tried to cut it down more to leave more time for discussion. This paper is not part of my dissertation research. It's in the very early stages, so I really appreciate comments and questions, and perhaps even via email conversations that can help me with this. Okay. It's really difficult to be healthy if you're poor, Sally Benedict said. You have to be heroic to move beyond that poverty. Benedict knows heroism. She saw it often in the women with whom she worked in North Carolina communities in the 1990s and early 2000s. Benedict was the director of the HOPE projects at the Center for Health Promotion and Disease Prevention at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. For nearly 2 decades, she made regular trips to Eastern Carolina counties, where she directed a public health initiative called Health Works for Women, which eventually became the CDC-funded HOPE Works, and HOPE stands for Health Opportunities, Partnerships, and Empowerment. Asked by her interviewer why she chose to work with low-income women on health issues in rural counties of Eastern Carolina, Benedict went back to the 1960s and early 1970s, when she dropped out of college to become a VISTA volunteer and then started a women's health counseling service. For Benedict, health, economic security, and gender equality were and are intertwined issues for women. Her experiences in social movements 40 years ago provided her with tools in the 1990s in her work with low-income rural women who faced interconnected issues of poverty, poor health, domestic violence, and hopelessness. Today I'm going to share a few pieces of Sally Benedict's feminist journey. The oral history interview, which I consulted for this paper, was conducted using the life history approach, which allows for greater reflection and fuller life stories than more targeted interviews that focus on a specific theme or topic in a particular moment of an individual's life. In particular, I think this allows us to see what Dion Espinoza referred to yesterday as intergenerational feminisms. It really illuminates both the continuities over time and the turning points in an individual's life, in a movement, and in a particular locality. This paper demonstrates how the 1970s women's movement shaped Benedict's public health work in the 1990s, and how feminism was not only relevant to Benedict's life, but also to the women, Latina, African American, white, and Native American, with whom she worked. I would also like to offer some thoughts and questions about how we might develop a feminist approach to oral history for researching the 1970s women's movement. And here I'll just add a plug for an oral history project that Jessie and I have worked on. The Southern Oral History Program has over 100 oral history interviews with women in the American South, digitized audio and transcripts, and it builds on older series of oral histories on women's activism and leadership in the South. So we can talk to you about that. You can go to sohp.org if you want to listen to some of the interviews, including Sally Benedict's. Her full interview is available. Part 1, From Childhood to Motherhood. Sally Benedict's father was in the Air Force, so she spent the first 20 years of her life in constant motion. In the late 1960s, she enrolled at the University of Florida. After her freshman year, she moved to Western Massachusetts with her first husband. They both dropped out of college and spent 2 years as VISTA volunteers. We heard a little bit about that with Jessie's paper. Benedict remembers this as her first real introduction to poverty in America and to her awareness of her own economic privilege, coming from a solidly middle-class family. She recalls how some of the people in the struggling factory towns in Massachusetts where she volunteered would say to her, "Well, you're rich." Quote, "I had never thought of myself as rich, and I think that particular statement and being a VISTA volunteer at that time was just a huge eye-opener." It was through VISTA that Benedict first encountered the women's movement. Quote, "So I was probably 21, it was maybe 1969. I met a woman and she had lived in New York, and she told me about the women's movement and about consciousness-raising groups." In 1970, Benedict went back to college in Massachusetts, and she and other women from VISTA started a counseling service for women in North Adams, Massachusetts, and that's a city in the far northwestern corner of the state. A lot of you might know that because might be from Massachusetts. They provided information on women's bodies and health care, including birth control, and referrals for legal abortion services in New York. Benedict recalled 2 resources she used in the counseling service. One was a birth control handbook that came from McGill University, and the other was a little book published by the Boston Women's Health Collective called Our Bodies Ourselves. Quote, "It was a stapled together little newsprint, like maybe 40 pages, and it talked about our bodies ourselves." Radical. I had never, ever experienced anything like this, and most women hadn't, I think. Benedict's memories resonate with those of many women across the country in the 1970s. In the SOHP's collection of interviews with women on the women's movement in the American South, a keyword search of Our Bodies Ourselves turns up nearly 30 interviews that mention the book. For instance, Sarah Briggs, executive director of the North Carolina Council for Women, recalled that when she was an undergraduate at UNC in the early 1970s, the book that every girl read in high school and college was Our Bodies Ourselves. And when I read this paper to my boyfriend, he commented on how he knew about Our Bodies Ourselves from his teenage years in Ottawa. He had 2 older sisters. And when he became a parent in the 1990s of 2 daughters, he bought a copy of the book to have on the family bookshelf. So I really think there's something to this book that really deserves a lot of attention. Benedict marks this time in her life as a turning point. Quote, "That is how I decided that I was passionate about women controlling our own bodies and about working with healthy women. I was never interested in being a doctor or a nurse or working with sick people. I thought it was absolutely incredible and wonderful to think about how a woman can stay healthy through understanding our bodies." Shortly thereafter, she graduated from college, she had a baby, and moved to Chapel Hill with her husband. Because of the women's health movement, motherhood helped to further politicize her and further directed her towards her field of public health. As Benedict narrated the first half of her adult life, the line that connects her feminist experiences in the 1970s with her work in the 1990s is clear. Quote, "So by that time, I had been in groups of women. I had been in consciousness-raising groups. I had been in Lamaze. That was a revolutionary thing for me and very empowering, being pregnant with both of my children and being in control of the birth and the breastfeeding and all of that, and then taking that passion and background and starting my master's in the public health program at UNC, where I focused on the women's health movement as much as possible." Part 2, the Hope Projects. From 1993 until she retired in 2011, Benedict worked with women in communities in Eastern Carolina. In the eastern part of the state, it's mostly rural, and it has always struggled with issues of poverty, high unemployment rates. It's a tough place. At first, she worked with women in factories on issues of nutrition, exercise, stress management, and the effects of smoking. Benedict wanted to move the project into the communities and focus more on stress management. Quote, "We kept hearing from the women that the main health issue that they had was the stress of their lives. The stress that they talked about was not just from the jobs they had. They had blue-collar jobs, but then when they went home, they had another full-time job, which was to take care of their husbands, their children, their husband's mother, their sister, their church. We called it the struggle to juggle." Benedict worked with a team of UNC people from public health, family medicine, graduate student assistants, and also local health workers in Eastern Carolina. A fundamental concept of the project was recruiting and training leaders among the women she sought to counsel and help. Quote, "You recruit volunteers from the workplace who are likely to talk to other people about these issues. That's the model of lay health advisors." The project became the CDC-funded HopeWorks project, and then in 2010, it was the Hope Accounts for Women, which supported a broad range of things: financial literacy, helping women start savings accounts with matching funds. It promoted healthy eating and exercise, job training. Benedict called it a holistic program. Unfortunately, I don't have time to do justice to this project and the team's accomplishments, but I will highlight one example of how Benedict's experiences in the 1970s women's movement directly infused her public health work. She started something she called the Hope Circles, safe, confidential spaces for the women that she modeled on consciousness-raising groups. She described what went on when the women started talking. Quote, You know, what women always say when women get together like that is just how empowering it is. I remember it in the late 1960s. You mean I'm not the only one who's felt this way? And I think that these hope circles did the same thing for women. They would get together and they would say, yeah, you know, I've had this problem with the banks too. They treated me that way. There was that, and then there was the sharing of the personal stories. A lot of women have stories, sad stories of abuse, rape, violence. Many, many, many women have been battered, and they would share those stories. We were all crying, but then they would say, it's so wonderful to have a place to go and be able to say whatever you want to say and not be judged for it. It was very powerful in many ways. Benedict then noted that it's, quote, hard to quantify that kind of thing, referring to the value of the sharing and empowerment in the Hope Circles. So this speaks to something I've been thinking about a lot, especially at this conference. How do we evaluate the achievements of the women's movement when many of the issues and ways they were addressed are not easily quantifiable? A feminist approach to oral history interviewing is instructive here, where interviewers and listeners are attentive to the narrator's sense of what she believed to be possible in a given moment in her life, possible to do, to achieve, to change, and what experiences and relationships changed that sense of the possible. I'm going to read one more excerpt from Benedict's interview and offer one final comment. Quote, after Hurricane Floyd devastated Eastern Carolina in 1999, we called together our community advisors and we said to them, how can we help? What can we do? And they said, we've been hearing a lot of stories about violence, particularly child abuse and intimate partner violence. We said, we're not experts in that area, but we certainly have resources at UNC to bring in. We were able to bring in women from UNC and bring in the local domestic violence agencies to help us. And some of the stories the women told about the inequality in their relationships. One woman said, a man's only going to do what a man wants to do. If my husband feels like helping me, he will. If he doesn't, he won't. And women would say, I'll come home from work all day standing on the production line, and my husband's sitting in the chair. I walk in the door, he's been sitting there all day watching TV, and the first thing he says to me is, what's for dinner? Another woman said, a man's only good for two things, sperm and lifting heavy objects. And nowadays, you don't even need them for the sperm. There were some great quotes, but that was sort of that life that these women had. So Benedict then in the interview compares her life with those of the women she worked with, reflecting on the relative ease that her class privilege and geographic location afforded her for living a healthy lifestyle and having an egalitarian relationship. She continued, quote, and then you think about the women there who have all of these issues of violence and poverty to deal with. That's their lives. And most of them are obese. They have diabetes and heart disease, and they have difficulty walking. And it's not through any fault of their own. It's just the chance of where they were born. Benedict relates the problems of health, stress, and personal violence with the women's geographic location, economic insecurity, and social worlds, and compared their circumstances with her own life story. So here I see a tension in her reflections that mirrors some scholarly debates about the reach of the feminist movement in the 1970s. So on one hand, recent literature has shown that feminism was a diffuse grassroots movement. It wasn't just confined to Boston and Chicago and New York, and it affected the lives of women of different social classes, races, and ethnicities. And issues of economic inequality and race justice were at the heart of most of the efforts. Benedict's story reflects all of this, and in particular illuminates her awareness of herself and her position in life. So I think there are so many instances in her interview that really contradict the stereotype of the white middle-class woman swooping in to save her poor sisters. You know, she worked with these women, she learned from them and with them, and she would ask, what can we do to help? On the other hand, Benedict points to the limits of the reach of the women's movement, reflecting on how she was liberated in the 1970s in Massachusetts and in Chapel Hill from the problems of personal violence and unequal family relationships that the women in Eastern Carolina in the 90s were struggling with every day. I would argue that this does not speak to the failures of the women's movement, but rather to the persistence of structural obstacles that persist, poverty, unemployment, and underfunded social services. So finally, I'll pose a question that her story raises. Were the women that she worked with in Eastern Carolina feminist? Or would they consider themselves liberated or part of the women's movement? So here I would defer to an interview that I did with a former Glen Mary nun in Appalachia, where she called herself an unintentional feminist. Quote, "We weren't out there being feminist, but we just had to be and didn't realize that was a part of it." So I think that as scholars, as we look at the 1970s women's movement, we need to look for these unintentional feminists. It has a lot of potential for understanding both the reach and the limits of American feminism. And I'd like to just thank Sally Benedict. She's here today. She came up for the conference to attend the panel. She is still in Chapel Hill. She is still very much interested in helping people live healthy, full lives. She teaches yoga to senior citizens. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you so much to all three of our panelists. I have just a couple of things to say briefly by way of comment to try to tie these three papers together, but then we wanted to leave lots and lots of time for Q&A, which we have sort of managed to do. But we're ahead of the curve, I think, for the other panels I've gone to, so that's good. So what struck me when I read these three papers was the very clear connections between many of them. Both Hannah and Joey point to the centrality of health in a women's movement, especially the women's movement that persists after the 1970s, as health is a really sort of central aspect of that. And Joey and Jesse both really point to the importance of considering place and class and all of the specifics that make a women's movement in a particular place. And at a particular time, and really being very, very sensitive to those issues. All three of the papers touch on the importance that their organizers placed on having people within the community helping to do the work. You know, that you have to, that's how you're attentive to those place and class, those specific contexts, is by, bringing local people into the movement, even if you are, as Sally was, somewhat coming in from the outside, or the woman from Detroit whose name I'm losing that came to Eastern Kentucky from in Jesse's piece. So I have just a couple of questions for each of you individually, and then one more sort of thing to say to wrap up. For Hannah, my main question was, in the context of this panel in particular, what about your story do you think is distinctively Southern? Is there anything that's distinctively Southern about it? And I'll do all three and then let you answer if that's okay. And I think specifically just from thinking about my own work and other people who've written on women's issues and even just more generally on leftist activism in the South, maybe are there differences between what they say internally and what they say publicly, things like that might point to an impact of the South or not. And I'm going to come back to that or not, because that's one of the interesting things I think about all three of these together. For Jesse, first of all, I think thank you for at the very end, you talk about social transformation rather than gender separatism, which I think is huge and is so important for thinking about how, again, women who are not the sort of key theoreticians of the movement are dealing with the movement and making it relate to their own lives. So I thought that was a really great way of phrasing that and a really important point. And I also had, you guys are going to sense a theme. I had a somewhat similar question to you as I did to Hannah in terms of how distinct to Eastern Kentucky, to Appalachia, are this deeply intersectional movement. How distinctly, in case you can't tell from the way I say Eastern Kentucky, I am from Kentucky, so I'd love to think that it's sort of distinctively Eastern Kentuckian, but I don't know that it is, and so I think that's an interesting thing to deal with as well. And then for Joey, and I know this is like your first thing with this project, but I think just as you move forward with it, has anyone done any oral history with the women who were clients of the Hope Projects? Is there any way that we can sort of get that side of the story and bring that into conversation as well? Which I think that's what you were getting at with your question at the end of how do, Sally's story is so wonderful, but then the other side of it, how do the women who are participating in this see it themselves, I think would really sort of enrich and deepen the analysis in your paper. And I think what all three of these papers together do is give us a really wonderful opportunity to reflect on questions of Southern distinctiveness and Southern exceptionalism. and to reflect on Southern womanhood and Southern feminism as distinctly different, and to think about the points of similarity and of contrast between Southern feminism and feminism in other places throughout the United States and throughout the world. And the question that I want to pose to all three of you, and really for all of us to think about, is region the most salient division? Or is it more the nature of the activism, this definition of grassroots activism that grassroots feminism that Jesse started with? Is that perhaps the more salient divide, that we look at, again, sort of leaders versus grassroots feminists? But does the grassroots look, in large part, look pretty similar regardless of whether it's Southern or not? So we've talked about this yesterday a little bit in relation to what I'm thinking about for my second project, but so they sort of know that this is coming for me. But I think your papers all really raise this question of Southern exceptionalism and Southern distinctiveness in a really interesting way. And so, yeah, especially as relates to feminist activism, that I think is a really interesting point of connection between all of them. All right. Thanks, guys. So take it away. Do you guys want to Hannah, I know you want to answer, and then if you guys want to, or then we'll just take questions. And actually, I'll stay up here. So, but Hannah,
I don't have to answer.
No, go ahead. If you want to. I'm
this
not going
on?
to throw a question at you and then
Okay.
I'll let you answer it.
Is this on? Can you guys hear me through this? Yes, no?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, thanks. So regarding if there's anything distinctly Southern about what I'm talking about, I think yes and no. So in this clinic in particular in Atlanta, I would say that there are more salient race issues than at many of the other clinics. Again, something I want to get into more with my dissertation. I'm just starting to look at this. And on the other hand, no, I don't think there's anything remarkably Southern about this because it's part of a larger federation of clinics that started in Los Angeles, because they're trying so hard to make sure that things are consistent amongst that. On the other hand, I think that no, it's really affected by more of a national movement. Another way that I would say, though, that perhaps it is a Southern story is that as the story of self-help continues, especially with women of color, a lot of that activism happens in the South, in Atlanta. In fact, if you've heard of Loretta Ross or Billie Avery, a lot of the self-help that they were doing and taking it in totally different directions was very much based there. Does that kind of get it?
Yeah, that's great. Do either of you two have something you want to say off the top, or should I just open it up? Okay. Alrighty. Questions from anyone? Comments, thoughts? Yeah. As loud as you can.
In the southern region, as far as your research has gone, have you come across any organizations or any clinics that dealt with substance abuse in regards to like a feminist perspective or a women's liberation perspective?
I haven't, but that would be a really interesting angle to pursue. Jesse?
Yeah, in Appalachia, in Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, and throughout West Virginia, a lot of the women who were part of these early clinics have now moved on to, they've become substance abuse counselors for people with addiction. There's an epidemic of pain pill use in Appalachia. So it's a lot of the women who were involved in the 70s and 80s who are now tackling this issue. A lot of young women are addicted. So I do think, I haven't done that research, but I think it's a really interesting question and topic for someone to trace out that movement.
Just while you guys are thinking, I know you asked specifically about the South, but there was a lot of work, similar work done with Native American women trying to use the process of self-help to deal with alcohol abuse. And I don't know much about that yet, but that wasn't really happening in the South.
Thank you. Actually, that just reminded me, I did do an interview with a woman named Patricia Grant. It's in the SOHP collection. You can look her up by her name. And she is a Cherokee woman who works at a substance abuse clinic rehab facility in Cherokee, North Carolina. So that could be a place to go if you're interested in hearing her talk about that. No, but just her perspective as a woman, like a sort of woman-centered woman perspective on helping her community, men and women, with alcoholism primarily, but substance abuse in general.
Yes, thank you.
I really enjoyed the panel. I thought it was terrific, actually, in a variety of ways. And I thought it was a nice follow-up to Sarah Evans' more analytic work done at, regional and place-based. And I wanted to particularly thank Jessica, right, for looking at how the anti-poverty program was a springboard to a lot of grassroots feminism and the women's movement. And I like the fact that all three of you connected it to health, because that has been sort of underplayed. It's been controversial in some ways in the movement. Last thing I'll say is, I don't actually think there is a lot of Southern exceptionalism, because I also co-directed a poverty program in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and almost everything you said would really apply to the women and men that we worked with there, particularly the women who went on, who also became leaders and became part of the women's movement.
We need to talk. I want to hear more about that.
And I also taught at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, in the sociology department. So I'm really pleased to be
Since you brought up the Southern exceptionalism piece, I thought I would just say something
yeah,
about that too.
Yeah, please.
I agree with you. I don't think it's particularly Southern, though. A lot of the issues that a lot of American issues. Well, right. Though that happens in Pennsylvania, that happens in other places as well, and out west. But poverty, these issues that often we think of Appalachia as poor, Mississippi is racist. These are American issues, and these become these states are the containers for those issues. But I think you look at any community of working class or people who are suffering from poverty, there's going to be a lot of similar stories. So thanks for your comments, and I'd love to hear more about Pittsburgh. She's from Pittsburgh.
And your comment brought up two things for me. I agree with you that the health angle, so often it's just abortion and birth control, and Sally Benedict talks about abortion and birth control, but she also talks about smoking, nutrition, exercise, and how to, health for poor women. So that was part of my goal with that angle. And then the other on the Southern, I think the only thing that I've noticed more distinct in my interviews with Southern women is how much more they talk about religion and church. And if you interview a woman not specifically about Southern feminism and you ask her about religion and church, there's lots to say, but you have to sort of ask for it. It doesn't surface up, whereas, you asked if I had interviews with the Eastern Carolina women, and I don't. And Sally was telling me last night, you need to interview Pastor Pat. She's an amazing woman. She was one of my community people. So that might be the one place where I do see, I don't like exceptionalism so much, but an angle to follow and to really look closely at.
The women of color in the anti-poverty program, they all talk about church as well. And very, very large part. And a lot of them migrated from the South. So you may be right, except that it went with them when they went north.
Yeah. But anyone called Pastor Pat's going to be a good way in to a rural Southern community. That's going to be a good door. That's going to be a good way to open the door for sure. Other questions? Other comments? Yeah.
I have a question for Jessica. So you talked about how women flocked to the anti-poverty program started in 64 and 65. I was wondering if you had a sense of kind of the causal relationship there. So did the anti-poverty programs fall in with people that had not been involved in Feminist Activism or any sorts of activity like that, or did kind of pre-existing networks and pre-existing organizations take advantage of these new programs to leverage goals or campaigns that were
That's a great question. So both, really. I mean, some of the women were a part of the union tradition. They were married to men who were members of the UMWA for all intents and purposes. They considered themselves union women. So there were some of those women, but then others, like Eula Hall, for instance, she says the war on poverty came along, and it's basically like her life begins there. She was married to an incredibly abusive man who was suffering from mental illness, was an alcoholic, and she had no way out. There were no jobs for her in her community. She couldn't drive. He wouldn't allow her to learn how to drive. Vista volunteers taught her how to drive. She kept a Vista volunteer in her house, and she received, I think, like $12.50 a week for room and board. It gave her a little bit of income, and then she eventually becomes a volunteer and makes, I think, $50 a week. I could be a month. But anyway, she has an income, and so that really puts her on a path to activism. And most of her activism is after the so-called end of the war on poverty. It's in the 70s. I would argue the war on poverty didn't end in 68, 69. But anyways, so you have women like that and others who are active, but looking for other ways to gain resources. Anything else?
I actually have a question for Hannah. I know I shouldn't
Go for
do
it.
that, but
Go for it.
when you were talking about, so throughout your paper, I kept remembering this episode of Mad Men where Peggy goes to get birth control and the doctor's like smoking a cigarette while she's on the table. And he's like telling her, I'm gonna give you this birth control, but like, don't go screwing around too much with it. So first of all, I was wondering, when you teach this or talk to people about this, do you get like a lot of, what is the reaction? Do you get like, oh my God, like that actually happened? And then also as a teacher, how would you teach like in a classroom to talk about this?
That's a good question. Previously, when I've presented on this topic, I've focused more on menstrual extraction, which, as I mentioned, is a method of removing the contents of the uterus, and women use this to get rid of like periods and their cramps, menstrual cramps, but also as a method of really early abortion. So that gets a lot of pushback, I think, and a lot of I had a young woman once say, well, that just had to be so painful. It sounds like a torture chamber. And that's the kind of thing I get a lot and have to correct. In terms of putting this in the classroom, I'm teaching a women's world history class in the fall, and I've been thinking about how to use just this in the context of reproductive rights and also women's health to do exactly what you guys are saying and show that it's about more than just abortion and birth control. Those things are related and they're important, but there's so much more to it. Does that kind of get to what you're...
Yes, and then here.
Okay, just a very quick comment. I was reared back in the 70s on the self-help movement, and just hearing some of this from the perspective of other parts of the country was really pretty interesting. I'm not so much speaking to the exceptionalism,
Sure.
but just elements of the movement at that time. Some of the threads of women becoming liberated in their own lives. But I do want to say that if we look at the last 30 years, there is a war on women everywhere on this planet. There isn't a place you can go on this planet where women are not extremely oppressed, degraded from the moment they are born. They are facing this. In the sweatshops, with the proliferation of pornography into the mainstream, and incredible proliferation of rape pornography. I can just go down the line, and certainly around abortion, which is a frontline battle right now. If women cannot, this is what I want to say, it has a lot to do with not even just health or economic equality, but if women do not have a right to control their own bodies and decide when they want to be mothers, they're enslaved. It's just that simple. And I just want to invite people and encourage people that some of us here are part of the movement for revolution. And this is about liberating from all forms of inequality, all forms of exploitation. A very radical way out, but I think the one that is the most realistic for what we're facing for women and everyone. So please come talk to us. But I really appreciate. I didn't realize this was going to be more of an academic panel, so it's very interesting in contrast to other panels.
Well, thank you for coming, and thank you for your work and your commitment to your work.
Well, we need more people.
I would love to do an oral history interview with you so that, your story, more people hear your story. And we're
So there was a there and then here. Thanks. A little bit louder if you can.
Oh, my question's for Joey. And you mentioned that Benedict, they went to the North College, and it's sort of where she first learned the movement, sort of first spin movement, and then she went back home to the South. Were there any sort of Southern precedents of sort of women's liberation before she came back that you know of in like East Carolina, or was it sort of something that had to be brought down?
Oh, That's a great question. So we don't know a whole lot about Eastern Carolina. So she's working in there in the 90s, so that's where I'm starting from. But that's a good question that I need to follow up on. But overall, what we've found is we've done interviews throughout the South, is that in rural areas, you're not gonna be as likely to see a now chapter or sort of a visible, like, oh, there it is, there's the women's movement. But interviews that we do, it's women sort of talking about, like, when they sort of start to encounter the identifiable women's movement, it's like, oh, yeah, like, my mother was a leader in her church, or I always organize the potluck dinners for the community that's struggling, or I taught my daughters to be strong and not take shit from a man. So I think that this is sort of the grassroots thing we're trying to get at, and through the oral history interviews, just let them tell the story in their terms, and then see where it intersects with the more visible things that we're used to seeing for the women's movement.
Yeah. She's Sally. This has to have been a slightly surreal experience for you to hear yourself talked about in the third person.
And I probably should have just said, well, let's ask Sally.
I'm sorry.
So we moved from Western Massachusetts to UNC Chapel Hill to go to graduate school. And when I went to graduate school in School of Public Health, I was sharing this with Joey last night. There were a lot of women in my department, which was community health organizing, community health, and in maternal and child health, who were feminists, and really into the self-help movement. And we started a self-help group where we all had special, and then we started to train medical students at Duke University and at medical school at UNC. And most of the medical students at UNC stay in North Carolina. We trained them to do vaginal exams. We were there showing them our services and talking to them and empowering them as well. So I'd like to think, and this is this evaluation thing too, how do you know how many people you reach? But I really like to think that a lot of those went on to become doctors who knew a whole lot more about women's experiences, whether they were women or not. There was a great cadre of us at the University of North Carolina. Some of those women were from North Carolina and some weren't, but that was nice to have these stories.
I'll also just, oh, that's loud, sorry. I'll also just say, to sort of piggyback off of that as well, just from my own research, is Sarah Evans here? I know she's here at the conference. Is she's not in the room, I didn't think so. So in Chapel Hill in 1973, I'm pretty sure she was still there at that point. But there were consciousness raising groups that Sarah Evans and others were part of. They had a feminist children's book press called Lollipop Power that published non-sexist children's books. And then also in Durham, there was a really thriving women's center at the YWCA in Durham next door. So that ran, that had a women's health center and did abortion referrals and did all sorts of there was a lesbian feminist group that met there and had this really diverse array of feminist programming within the YWCA. So yeah, I think specifically because you landed in Chapel Hill, you hit a good spot in the South in '73. There was a lot going on there in '73. Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm at the School of Public Health at Brown University, and the only way for those of us who are teachers right now, so research faculty in the School of Public Health have to raise 100% of their salaries for a graduate student. So it means that I have to bring in external funding, and I'm glad you're here. So for me, doing applied public health is mostly Centers for Disease Control funding, and you shape your work under enormous pressure to bring in external dollars, whether it's NIH or your centers. You shape sometimes your research in order to get that funding stream, and I think for both of you, I make sure I don't just point to Hannah and to Jessica. So I would like to have heard more, because it's something I struggle with and have for many, many years. How do you as a feminist scholar, looking at sort of, also make sense of the other poles that are on some of the movements you're studying that also are very much affected by the external or the government funding that's come in? I also want to echo what the it's very hard to get external dollars from funders who, for whom a feminist perspective is about as far away as one could imagine. And I'm so glad you're here because you also, at some point, I think your project was CDC funded, and I admire you for able to keep your true to your original intent. But it is the women that you are talking to, and the women who, whether it's in the anti-poverty movement or the women's health movement, have to grapple with this. And so I just hope you would, as you continue in your excellent work, I hope you can find a way to illuminate that.
Yeah, that's a great insight, and something that I think in my larger work on the war on poverty, part of the power of the war on poverty was the maximum feasible participation of the poor, and they did have a lot of control over what they were doing, and certainly we don't have that kind of model anymore, right? Right. So I think if any, in part, I'm trying to salvage the war on poverty, which has been cast as a major failure. I think as feminists, we need, and there was a lot of critiques of the war on poverty from the left. But when you look at these rural communities, it actually was very empowering for them on the ground. So it's not exactly answering your question, but it's another kind of piece of this.
We've got time for maybe one more. Yes, thank you.
Well, I hesitate to ask this because I don't remember enough of the details about the work that Linda K. Stout did, or whether she was working in South Carolina or North Carolina. I think she's probably doing organizing now. She did organizing around economic issues, not health issues. She was driven out of whichever state she was in, North Carolina or South Carolina, because it was physically too dangerous for her. She did organizing around issues of runaway plants, and she went to people and talked about how the plants that were running away to El Salvador, people shouldn't blame El Salvadorians for the runaway plants. She's written at least one book about that, and she may be now living in Western Massachusetts. But the reason she's in the back of my mind, and I wish I could remember more details about the work she did, is that what struck me in all of your talks was there was less of a sense, and I wondered how this is maybe because you were not dealing with that part, or it was less a part of these people's experience, of hostile communities' responses. But Linda K. Stout came from a working class family. She describes how she was discriminated against in school because she would do extremely well, but she had the wrong accent and the wrong class background. And eventually she dropped out of school. So she was part of a poor rural community, and her politics made her extremely vulnerable to physical danger. She thought she might be killed, so she eventually left. And she also had success as an organizer, clearly. So I wondered if you deal with health and women's issues, are you somehow safer? No.
I love they're all just like, no.
No, I kept it positive. There are several women in my study who they're insiders, and they're also under attack. So the Klan organizes in Harlan County, throughout eastern Kentucky, throughout the South. There's a resurgence, right, in the 70s, and several women have to flee in the middle of the night, never come back, really. So some of the strongest activists are run out of town, and I think that's really significant for maybe the kind of lack of a strong women's movement in some of these places today. Some of the strongest leaders either had to, stop what they were doing, they had to flee, or kind of gave up on this. Largely, it's a sad story, the one I'm telling, just not the part I told you today.
And of course, I'm sure you guys know that a very similar thing happened in a lot of clinics that provided abortions. And that's a large part of the reason that I think that feminists found self-help so important even later on into the movement, is because not only was the government threatening the legality of Roe, but also there was these daily physical threats of women trying to get into clinics. So a lot of for example, the menstrual extraction tour. That was a lot to do with a reaction to that kind of thing, I think.
And clinics in the South are shutting down left and right. I want to point back to our friend. Yes. We did research in East Tennessee on reproductive justice. There were 2 clinics. One shut down a couple of years ago after the state legislature passed laws to ensure that would happen. So, I mean, that's a current story.
Even when we're not talking about abortion and birth control, which is the most visible of this sort of violence against women's health. At the beginning of the conference, I was talking with a woman who her colleague is being attacked at the university, and I'm going to leave details out because it's not something I don't know if I should be sharing. But the hate emails that are coming, one of them, it's like, she's just angry because she's fat, and if she would just learn to put down a cheeseburger, she would stop railing against men in capitalism. And, and it's just, all of the women get attacked on multiple levels. And I specifically included the quote from Sally about, it's not, it's always like a personal attack on, well, if you're unhealthy, it's your fault. Don't blame the system. Don't blame your town. Don't blame the hospital or. So, and I think that's all wrapped up together, that it's your fault, from the most visible, slut shaming to, a tenured professor being told to put down a cheeseburger because of what she studies. Sorry.
Yeah. Last word.
This is who deserves the last word.
Yeah, that's why she's getting it. Yep.
Well, I'd just like to share a little story, which was brought up in this last question, and people talking about the Southern experience. In the Atlanta Health Center, 10, 15 years ago, I don't remember the exact time, but when Operation Rescue was, just blocking the clinic, I mean, wall to wall, days on end. Of course, they couldn't do anything about that, but the police were there, they dealt with that. But after that, the anti-abortionists started doing this thing where they would, some of the more aggressive ones, they would come into the waiting room and do a sit-in. I don't know if this is one of the things or not. The women got what to do that with, because of course it's totally destructive. And then if they called the cops, they'd come and get the person, but by that time, their clinic was completely messed up and, it was a horrible mess. So they decided on a plan, and the next time that this happened and someone came in and went in the living room, in the reception room, 6 or 8 women pre-trained and figured it out. They all just went over and picked up a piece of him and just carried him unceremoniously out the front door and dumped him on the front sidewalk.
Awesome. It's a great story.
And they did that a few times, and it stopped. They, believe me, no, that was kind of exceptional. That is the most effective, coordinated, but totally nonviolent and polite way I ever heard of.
I just have an addendum to that, and that's really fabulous, but when they used to chain themselves to the gynecological tables, like, leave them. See how long it takes their lawyers to get them out when they voluntarily chain themselves to the tables. They let them go to the bathroom, let them, get hungry and want a cigarette, and that would have probably stopped that one.
Yeah. There's more than one way to skin a cat.
Yeah. Thank you all. I want to be respectful of our time and let everybody get over to Linda Gordon at 3:40 for the closing keynote, but thank you all very, very much for the comments.